Hey y'all, thanks for stopping by and welcome to A Texas Girl Talks. I'm Lorena, your gal pal and host, and I'd like to invite you to grab a glass of sweet tea and join me on the porch for another story about Texas tenacity. This is a family-friendly spot where we talk about pathways, providence, and life in general from a decidedly southern perspective. Whether I'm sharing tales of the hard-scrabble existence of my grandparents, interviewing a Texas icon, or just chatting it up with my girlfriends, I can promise you'll be wanting a spot on the porch swing. So stick around. It'll bless your heart. For me, it began with a love story, but not a romance. It was a story about the love that a child has for her grandparents. Over time, the story evolved into an investigation of the history of these people who'd been the bedrock of my childhood, the when and the where of it all, and even more recently, an exploration and analysis of the psychology of my ancestors, the what and why of the life they carved out for themselves, and very, very often, the how, an attempt to understand the cloth from which I'm cut, so to speak. I've no doubt that my memories of Tom and Buena Davis have a patina of nostalgia that I absolutely do not want to polish away. If they didn't view the time spent with me through the same lens I look through when I ruminate on our times together, then I don't want to know it. Those days were perfect to me then. They remain perfect today. In my rememberings, I walk a tranquil dirt road back to times that were free of the cares of adulting. On these walks, I find my inner child alive and well. She takes me by the hand and says, "I've been waiting for you. What took so long?" Obediently, joyfully, I let her lead me back, until I stand once more before the screen door of the ranch house. I grasp the handle, swing the door wide with a creak, and... My Papa Davis, the name by which I referred to my paternal grandfather, loved me. Perhaps it's only because I had him in my life for a few short years, or maybe it would have been this way had he lived until I hit my 20s, but there was never a rupture in our relationship. Papa and Mama Davis lived on the ranch at Sonora, Texas. My family and I lived in Stephenville, but made frequent trips out west. I've been told that every time one of those trips came to an end and Mom and Dad were trying to pack me into the car to leave, that Papa and I would both cry. It's funny how scents can evoke such vivid memories. Whenever I smell grapefruit, I'm taken back to that linoleum-covered kitchen table in the ranch house. A hearty breakfast of fried eggs, bacon, and toast was served up daily, along with a grapefruit half sprinkled with sugar and topped with a maraschino cherry. I washed it down with a cup of cowboy coffee as I watched Papa sop up the egg yolk with his toast. I ate fast, wanting to be ready when he stood from the table, grabbed his sweat-stained felt hat, and tucked a pack of juicy fruit gum, a small spiral notebook, and a stubby pencil into his shirt pocket. I knew that meant we were headed outside for the morning chores, which to me were never something to be dreaded at all, but the sweetest fulfillment of all the things that made life wonderful. It never occurred to me to stay behind and help Mama Davis with the kitchen cleanup. I was born to accompany Papa as we climbed into his faded blue pickup with wooden sideboards. The inside was dusty, and the vinyl seat cover was cracked. The floorboard was littered with chunks of cow cake, wire cutters, old leather work gloves, and bits of grass and dirt. The gum wrappers, however, had better go in my pocket because that was trash. The windows were always rolled down, and the dawn air smelled of dust and growing things. Mourning doves called, and quail whistled, "Bob White? Bob White?" I tried my best to imitate them, but I hadn't gotten the hang of whistling or blowing bubbles with my chewing gum yet. Killdee birds ran the Caliche Road in front of us as Papa shifted gears, and I hung onto the door handle for dear life as we bounced toward the barn. It was a big, red wooden thing, with rock walls and sorting pins made of long boards nailed to posts set deep into the hard-packed soil. In the dark and cavernous shearing shed, 2 high metal racks stood ready for the long bags that the wool or mohair would be collected in as the sheep and goats were shorn. Tucked away in a corner closet was a working toilet and sink, which was pretty ritzy for 1970. The adjacent part of the barn was the tallest, accommodating a hayloft accessible by a built-in ladder. A huge wooden door slid to one side, so a pickup could be driven into the barn and parked in the perfect position to catch several bales of coastal hay tossed down from above. Underneath the floor of the hayloft, horse stalls and a tack room drew me like the moon pulls at the tides. There was only one other building in the barn area that could get me as worked up as that horsey-smelling stable area, and that was the shed across the road from the barn. It held a collection of cane fishing poles and a tackle box full of bobbers and fish hooks. After the morning chores were done, if Papa felt good, chances were I would have my choice of riding around the trap on Methuselah or taking a couple of those cane poles down to the tank to catch a mess of perch. Sitting up high on the ancient brown gilding as he plodded in circles made me feel daring and grown up. Sometimes I could coax him into a trot that bounced me considerably and required me to grab the saddle horn to keep from falling off. My feet couldn't reach the stirrups, and my legs were still too short to get much of a grip on the slick sides of the saddle, and no matter how hard I kicked and smooched, we rarely graduated to the smooth gait of a lope. No matter, I was the queen of the cowgirls as I put him through his paces unassisted, although Papa was never out of sight. He'd sit in the shade and scratch in his notebook until he decided it was time to go back to the house for lunch. If he couldn't convince me to dismount in anticipation of a sandwich, he could appeal to my conscience by telling me how tired Methuselah must be, and I wouldn't want to make him lame by pushing him past his limits, would I? The old horse looked fine to me, but I sure didn't want to mess up my chances of riding him again the next day, so I didn't argue much. Other days, I preferred digging earthworms out of the mud that a leaky concrete water trough provided. We'd put 'em in a coffee can filled with dirt and coffee grounds and ride down to the pond. Papa would tie a stringer to a stick and jab it way down in the shallow water at the edge of the tank, and we'd collect the fish we caught as we sat in the shade on lawn chairs that Papa had unfolded under the big mesquite tree that grew on the bank. I'd concentrate intently on the bobber, willing it to go all the way under so I could give the pole a quick jerk upward to set the hook. I learned early on how to bait a hook and hold a perch so that the spiny fins couldn't puncture the skin of my hand. And when the temperatures rose to a minimum of 70 degrees, I was allowed to swim in the rock stock tank, kept full to the brim by the turning of the windmill by the hot currents of air that baked the moisture from the West Texas sky and left my skin feeling dry as powder. The water was cool and tinted green by the moss that covered the inside of the circular wall of the tank. Large goldfish nibbled at my toes and brushed by my legs as they propelled me awkwardly around the edges, bobbing up and down in my life jacket. I chafed at having to wear the hated thing. I was sure I could swim as well as any mermaid, but I was only allowed to glide through the water sans flotation device when Dad was in there with me. But I could manage to tip over enough to push my face underwater and open my eyes to look at the murky world below the surface. Did you know that water can taste and smell green? At least, that's how I remember it. Mama Davis grew roses. The bushes occupied the southwest side of the yard, a fragrant and colorful sticker patch. Look, but don't touch. Large pecan trees dipped gracefully over the rock wall that surrounded 3 sides of the yard. The front lawn was well kept and guarded from potential destruction by livestock by an ornamental metal fence. A lilac bush bloomed in spring, and a metal swing set waited for my brother and I to challenge each other to see who could swing the highest without causing the frame to buck out of the ground. In the near dark of evening, fireflies danced in the air that took on a mysterious sweet scent. It called up a touch of melancholy because that, along with the lights that began shining brightly out of the row of windows that overlooked the front porch, meant that the adults would soon be calling us inside and reminding us that we weren't actually the bosses of our own lives. Baths and bedtimes were non-negotiable, but if we didn't argue, we were treated to Jell-O and a story. The wall behind Mama and Papa Davis's reading chairs held a built-in bookcase. One shelf was filled with children's books. Some were gilded with gold leafing on the edges of the pages. Some had 3-dimensional pictures set into the front cover. Some had beautiful color illustrations that gave the characters faces and the landscapes definition. All were a magic rabbit hole for my imagination. My favorite book, though, was not one of the newer additions to the library. Rather, the covers of this book were worn, and the title was stamped in large black letters on the front. Billy Butter, it said, and a simple sketch of a goat with round balls mounted to the tips of its horns gave a clue that the story was about the adventures of a mischievous goat kid and the farm family that cared for it. It was published in 1936, and judging from the wear of the cover, it must have been one of my dad's childhood favorites. Mama and Papa Davis raised Angora and Spanish goats in addition to polled Hereford cattle and sheep. To successfully manage this on a 1,700-acre ranch in Sutton County, Texas, was no easy feat. Grass was not plentiful, and the limited resources meant practicing range management was essential if the herds were going to support both themselves and the family. An excerpt from Papa's obituary, Devil's River News, August 19, 1971, reads, Mr. Davis was an outstanding ranchman and citizen of the Sonora community for many years. He was one of the premier breeders of polled Rambouillet sheep in the United States and a longtime breeder of registered Angora goats. Fleeces from Davis's sheep won many regional, state, and national shows at Sonora, Brownwood, San Antonio, and Denver. He had the top fleece at the New Mexico State Fair in 1970 and the champion Rambouillet fleece at the National Western Wool Show in Denver this year. He has also shown the champion mohair fleece at the Texas International Wool and Mohair Show at San Antonio. A number of his sheep have been shipped to India and other countries to start breeding flocks. He was a member of the Texas Rambouillet Breeders Association, the Texas Sheep and Goat Raisers Association, and the Angora Goat Breeders Association. Mr. Davis was an early and continual supporter of performance testing of rams at the Sonora Experiment Station. He also pioneered testing rams on the ranch. A great supporter of 4-H club work, Davis was presented the Sutton County 4-H Contributors Award for superior service. He received the Outstanding Conservation Ranchman Award from the Edwards Plateau Soil Conservation District in 1953. He did extensive pioneer work in gathering and planting native and introduced vegetation on his ranch. He was a great wildlife enthusiast, raising and releasing hundreds of quail and other game birds. For many years, he tried to acclimatize mule deer to the area and produced a number of rare mule white-tailed deer crosses. In 1978, my dad, Rodney Ellis Davis, submitted a family history to the Sutton County Historical Society that published Sutton County History 1887 to 1977. He ended his contribution with these words, They, Tom and Buena Davis, were disciples of soil, water, and wildlife conservation. Due to hard work, they were successful ranchers on a place small by Sutton County standards. When I read these accounts, I realize that my grandparents had many layers. I knew them first as my retreat, my place of joy, my earliest treasure, those whom I revered as flawless. I've come to know them, posthumously, as mortal beings just like myself, prone to mistakes and missteps, capable of love and hate, joy and misery, grief and gratitude. They fell in love, married, had babies, lost children, survived the Great Depression and the drought of the 50s. Tom and Buena Davis faced tragedy and grief that would lay most of us out flat in this day and age. The grit of their ancestors flowed through their veins. I hope some of it is passed down to me as well. Their story is the prequel to mine. And over the next few months, till the well runs dry, I'm going to dip deeply into the waters of the past and share my cup with you. Hey y'all, thanks for stopping by and welcome to A Texas Girl Talks. I'm Lorena, your gal pal and host, and I'd like to invite you to grab a glass of sweet tea and join me on the porch for another story about Texas tenacity. This is a family-friendly spot where we talk about pathways, providence, and life in general from a decidedly southern perspective. Whether I'm sharing tales of the hard-scrabble existence of my grandparents, interviewing a Texas icon, or just chatting it up with my girlfriends, I can promise you'll be wanting a spot on the porch swing. So stick around. It'll bless your heart.